There's been a lot of chatter over the last few years about how Castlevania has lost its heart and soul as a series. Depending on your perspective, this may or may not be true, but one thing's for certain. The series has taken more than a few steps away from its roots. Many people clamor for more Metroidvania-style Castlevania games akin to one of the best games ever made, Symphony of the Night. And I totally support that. But I also have a simple question. What about Castlevania's true roots? What about the oft-overlooked NES trilogy that spawned the series in the first place? Castlevania, Castlevania II, Simon's Quest, and Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse are among the finest games on the NES, and that really means something because it's hard to beat NES's roster of standout titles. These games personified and epitomized the horror genre early in gaming's history, and continue to stand up today not only in terms of gameplay, but in terms of aesthetics, story, and above all else, ambience. Think about the original Castlevania and how extraordinary it is. With only 6 stages, it's a short game. If you know what you're doing, you could easily beat it in well under a half an hour. But it brings you on a journey. Indeed, this is a common theme throughout the NES trilogy, as all 3 games do an exceptional job of making you feel like you're really moving around, exploring, and trying to actually get somewhere. This is best represented in the original Castlevania by the map that appears in between stages of whipping the crap out of enemies, as you work your way out of the courtyard into the castle's entrance hall and then further and further to ultimately Dracula's turret chamber. The original Castlevania, for its short length, does an extraordinary job of changing up scenery along with the enemies you do battle with. Fighting the vampire bat with the axe is iconic in Castlevania, but so too is heading through Medusa's red-colored stage, fighting Dracula's mummies right after seeing an astounding shot of the rest of the castle in the background, and abusing Frankenstein and Grim Reaper alike with a brutal barrage of holy water. It's short but challenging. It's a tight game and it's totally complete, from the second you whip your first torch to the moment you vanquish Dracula's monstrous form and witness its brief ending. By the time the series went towards Castlevania II, Simon's Quest, Konami decided to change things up a little bit. This was commonplace in the NES era, making sequels different than the original game that spawned the franchise. The thing is, Castlevania II largely retained the original's aesthetic appeal and side-scrolling gameplay, but it became an open-ended, non-linear RPG, and is very easily one of the NES's most underrated and underappreciated games. Indeed, it's the single Castlevania game most begging for a modern remake. The original Castlevania made you feel like you were working through Dracula's gigantic castle, but its sequel gave you a feel for its surrounding environs in Eastern Europe. Non-linearity in and of itself in the late 80s was a huge deal, but it's how open-ended Castlevania II really is that made the game so special, and caused it to be the target of extreme ridicule, especially in hindsight. That ridicule, by the way, is entirely unearned. What I really love about Castlevania II is how spooky it is, how insanely atmospheric it is for an 8-bit game that is, at this point, 25 years old. The music is frightening, the day-night cycle is amazing, the feeling of being lost and alone is tangible. Unlike the original Castlevania, which hinged entirely on Dracula's castle, 99% of Castlevania II takes place outside of the castle. Its story revolves around reviving Dracula, who you killed in the first game, to rid Simon Belmont, the protagonist of the first 2 Castlevania games, of a curse Dracula's left him with. Doing so requires Simon to travel around the Eastern European countryside to find strewn about parts of Dracula's body, like his ribs, his eyes, and his heart. Fighting through caverns, forests, graveyards, and other locations is the name of the game. It exudes horror, especially when you go through perilous mansions, buying wooden stakes from mysterious vendors to complete your task. Once you get all of the pieces of Dracula's body, you travel to the destroyed castle you left behind in the first game to put his body back together, revive him, and then fell him once again. Of course, there's so much surrounding Simon's Quest that makes it even more compelling. The townsfolk you run into give you vague clues about what you should do, and merchants, sometimes well hidden, will sell you optional items like daggers, cloves of garlic, laurels, and whip upgrades to help make your adventure a little easier. But what's most special about Simon's Quest, and most confounding to some, is how obscure some parts of it are. You have to equip a crystal to see a hidden platform in the first mansion. You have to equip Dracula's heart to get a ferryman to bring you to a secret area in the game. You have to equip another crystal and then kneel down in areas to get secret locations to appear, ones that require you to wade through water or get whisked away by a tornado. Simon's Quest is challenging and outrageous in all of the right ways, but the challenge in particular can be mitigated if you find everything there is to find. Once you get the Flame Whip, nothing will stand in your way. By the time Castlevania III Dracula's Curse rolled around, Konami really hit its stride. The third game in the trilogy is considered by most to be one of NES's best games, and for good reason. Its soundtrack is insane, its gameplay is challenging and fluid, and it combines the best features of the first two games to make something that's a bit more familiar to fans of the original, while giving Simon's Quest fans the length and breadth they desire. In Castlevania III, you play as Simon Belmont's ancestor, Trevor. The game takes place well before the other two Castlevania games, complete with its own unique plot. Dracula's Curse's intro plays this out well and gives the game a real feeling of meaning, as you see Trevor praying at a disheveled cross before heading into harm's way. Like Simon's Quest, Castlevania III largely takes place outside of Dracula's castle, and it too is non-linear. In fact, the first half of the game in particular is so non-linear that there are parts of the game you may never see, entire stages you may never traverse, and friends you may never meet. That's right, friends. Castlevania III allows you to switch between characters as long as you find them. So if you head into the clock tower early on in the game, you'll find Grant, the knife-wielding pirate-like character that can hang on walls and ceilings. Cypher the mage and even Dracula's own son, Alucard, are also in the game. This adds something truly special to the game, something that gives it incredible replayability, considering you'll get different endings depending on who you play through the game with. And it continues the trend of making you feel like you're really journeying, going through the motions to track down Dracula. The first stage of Castlevania III may be one of the villages you went to in Castlevania II. By the time you get to the castle, you'll literally find yourself in places you were in the first game. Castlevania III does a marvelous job of drawing a continuous line from the first step you take in the original, right through the iconic climb to Dracula's throne room at the end, one that looks awfully similar in both games. There are more odes to the original here though. Frankenstein and the mummies, both iconic bosses from the original game, return in Castlevania III. Once you get to Dracula's castle about halfway through the game, a very familiar map of the terrain appears. And of course, the enemies you encounter, from Medusa heads to stacks of skulls and more, all return. Castlevania and Castlevania III bookend the trilogy by being informed by one another, and the games feel awfully complete as a result. It's easy to overlook the Castlevania trilogy on NES nearly 30 years after it began, but doing so is a huge mistake. Clamoring for more Symphony of the Night is great, we all want that, but do yourself a huge favor. Dust off your NES and your Castlevania cartridges, or go on the Wii and download the games from the Virtual Console, and sit down over a weekend and play through all three of them. Experience them one after another. Get immersed in what they're trying to do, the adventure they try to bring you on. These are truly special games, some of the best of all time, and any gamer worth his or her salt owes it to him or herself to understand why. Castlevania is truly special, and nothing explains why better than the NES trilogy that started it all.